From September 27th to October 9th, 1944, the 5th Infantry Division, of which Glenn was a part, was engaged in brutal and costly fighting during the Battle of Metz near the German border. It had been concentrating its efforts against the formidable German stronghold of Fort Driant. Glenn's 2nd Battalion of the 11th Infantry Regiment led the assault and suffered terrific losses with over 363 casualties. The combat was so intense that the battalion was nearly destroyed in the process. This offensive was part of General Patton's U.S. Third Army campaign to capture the heavily fortified French city of Metz. On October 16th, the division withdrew from the fight against the Germans after its initial attempts had failed. Following the withdrawal from the front line, the 5th Division needed to recover and replenish itself with replacements. For the remainder of October, up until November 9th, the unit remained away from the front, where it recuperated and reorganized near Villers-sous-Prigny, France. According to U.S. Army records at the National Archives National Personnel Records Center, the official Army hospital admission file for Glenn indicates that he was a passenger on a 2.5-ton Army troop truck. The vehicle was involved in an accident and Glenn was severely injured. He sustained significant injuries to his chest, including crushed ribs, a torn descending aorta, which caused hemothorax, and he also had a ruptured liver. The U.S. Army hospital documents state that he died in November 1944, but oddly, the actual date is missing from the form. Someone had forgotten to record the date. Glenn's grave marker in Lominick Cemetery near Chattanooga, Tennessee, states October 31st for his death, but this date does not coincide with any official records. Efforts to match this date with official documents have been unsuccessful. Rob Baker. On August 24, 1944, during the final phase of the Northern France campaign, Rob's 10th Infantry Regiment participated in a significant crossing of the Seine River near Fontainebleau, France. His regiment, part of the 5th Infantry Division in General George S. Patton's 3rd Army, saw its 2nd Battalion cross the Seine River on August 23rd and 24th against intense German artillery and mortar fire. Despite facing strong counterattacks, the battalion successfully established and maintained a vital bridgehead on the opposite bank, facilitating the continued advance of the main forces to pour across the river. The regiment's operations near Fontainebleau coincided with the liberation of Paris, about 43 miles to the northwest, which was formally surrendered by the German forces the next day, August 25th. During the day's intense fighting, while crossing the river, Rob was severely wounded in action. Neither the U.S. Army hospital admission records nor Rob's individual deceased personnel file specifies his cause of death or the exact location of him being wounded, only indicating that he was killed in battle on August 24, 1944. However, official regimental documents do confirm where his battalion crossed the river on the eastern side of Fontainebleau and held its position against repeated enemy counterattacks. During this time, the rest of his division crossed the river and reinforced the bridgehead that Rob's battalion established. Rob was transported to a U.S. Army field hospital near Ville-Cerf, just a few miles to the southeast of Fontainebleau, but he had already succumbed to his wounds. He is buried in Chandler Cemetery in Calhoun, Georgia. Frank Bennett. At 6 a.m. on Sunday, March 25, 1945, Frank's 2nd Battalion of the 60th Infantry Regiment launched an attack eastward from Ferntal, Germany, about 10 miles east of Remagen. Fighting alongside the regiment's 1st Battalion, they attacked German defenses around the first small village of Humbach, which was roughly half a mile ahead. After a struggle, the 2 battalions had captured the village by 10 a.m. The 1st Battalion then set up defensive positions alongside the Autobahn, just past Hombach. Frank's battalion continued the attack on its own for the remainder of the day to capture and secure the following 4 towns: Epgert, Krunkel, Obersteinbach, and Heiderhof. As the day's fighting was drawing to a close, Frank was resolutely operating his .30 caliber Browning machine gun to protect the men of his battalion during the attack on Krunkel. Suddenly, he was hit by a tracer round fired from a German machine gun. While lying prone and continuing to fire his weapon, the bullet struck the far left side of his helmet, then entered his left shoulder and exited near his belt buckle. He was killed almost instantly. Within hours of Frank's death, the entire German Wehrmacht, opposing Frank's 9th Infantry Division, suddenly began a disorganized retreat en masse. This retreat generally continued until Germany's unconditional surrender, just 6 weeks later. Chapman. On May 5, 1945, the B-29A-15BN Superfortress, serial number 4293953, with Howard Chapman as the flight engineer on board, took off from Northfield, Anderson Air Force Base on Guam, where he was stationed. It was on a bombing mission targeting Tachiarai Airfield on the island of Kyushu, Japan. Eyewitnesses reported that the aircraft was shot down by Japanese fighter planes and crashed at coordinates of 36 degrees, 46 minutes north, and 132 degrees, 15 minutes east. 8 parachutes from the 11 crewmen were seen opening, but the identities of those who bailed out could not be determined. The crew was listed as missing in action when the plane failed to return, and no survivors were found. One crew member, Corporal Irving A. Corliss, was captured by the Japanese and sent to a prison camp, but was executed on June 20th, 1945. Howard's body was never recovered. Hulan, Dutton. The B-17F Flying Fortress Heavy Bomber, construction number 3662, with a U.S. Army registration number B-17F-35BO and serial number 425123, had taken off from the Army Air Base at Great Falls, Montana at 1 p.m. Mountain War time, with 2 other B-17 planes on a navigation and formation training flight to Ainsworth, Nebraska. The 3 aircraft were to land, refuel, and then return to Great Falls. The formation began its climb to altitude and entered cloud overcast at about 8,500 feet, breaking out on top at about 16,000 feet. The ascent took about 20 minutes at an indicated airspeed of 140 miles per hour. All aircraft began to accumulate rime ice, about 1 inch thick, on the underside of the leading edge of the wings. The subject airplane, which was also the lead B-17, began accumulating carburetor ice while climbing through the overcast. After about 20 minutes of flying above the overcast clouds, the lead B-17 was seen to enter a descent into the clouds near Melstone, Montana. There was no further visual or radio contact between the formation and the lead plane after it began its descent. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing the B-17 falling out of the clouds, spinning out of control. The aircraft appeared to partially recover before it entered an extreme nose-up position. The plane then fell straight down and began to enter a flat spin, striking the ground with little forward motion on the slope of Mount Bull, about 11 miles south of Musselshell, Montana. The plane skidded about 100 yards down the mountainside. It was finally halted by 2 pine trees, which tore off both wings. The plane then exploded into flames. All 10 crew members, plus 2 passengers, were killed. The icing in the carburetors reduced the power of the plane's 4 engines, causing its initial descent. The pilots would have turned on the carb heaters and begun to lower its nose to prevent stalling, then wait for the engines to recover. But then the situation became even more severe. Probable main cause of loss of control. After a thorough investigation, a second, more serious problem most likely occurred during the descent. The plane began to enter a stall, and a complete loss of control was eventually caused by the fabric on the tail's elevator starting to rip, then completely detaching from the wing's frame, making the elevator ineffective for proper flight. A seriously flawed redesign of the fabric's adhesion procedure at Boeing used metal clips instead of the robust hand stitching, which caused the fabric's adherence to the wing to weaken and fail under pressure. An engineering fix had been designed and implemented as a retrofit. However, this particular B-17 had not received the correction. Even though the plane had increased its airspeed enough to possibly recover during the descent, it was unable to regain stable flight and plummeted to the ground. Hulon left behind a young wife, Julia, and a 6-month-old infant son, David. James Nix. On the 22nd of October, 1944, James's regiment was stationed in frontline defensive positions south of Bologna, Italy. The U.S. Fifth Army was in a battle of attrition with the Germans and had become bogged down in a stalled campaign to drive the enemy out of northern Italy. James had been assigned as a company cook. He and another soldier had gone on a run to gather field rations for the men in his unit. During this time, the Germans had launched heavy artillery barrages into the American lines. James and the other soldier were returning to the company to deliver the collected food rations when the jeep they were riding in suffered a direct hit from an enemy artillery shell. James received multiple shrapnel hits in his upper chest from the round. Both James and the other soldier who was driving the jeep were killed. James left behind a young wife, Mary, and an infant daughter, Edwina. McRae, Greason. On July 16, 1944, McRae boarded the USS LST No. 241 at Eniwetok, Marshall Islands, to take part in Operation Forager II, the invasion of Guam. Taking part in the main assault, McRae's 3rd Battalion of the 9th Marine Regiment landed on Blue Beach, July 21, 1944, near Azen Point, just south of Agana, Guam. McRae's entire division engaged in fierce fighting across the rugged terrain against the heavily entrenched Japanese forces. Their objective was to capture the strategically important high grounds just beyond the beaches. While climbing and fighting up the steep grade of the ridge, McRae was wounded. He was shot in the abdomen by the enemy, who were entrenched in heavy fortifications near the top of the ridge. He was evacuated to the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marine Aid Station for immediate treatment. A short while later, he was placed on a truck and taken to a U.S. Navy hospital ship. Tragically, he died from his wounds 7 days later on July 28, 1944, at 1:10 p.m. Jack Dutton. Jack's 2nd Battalion of the 376th Infantry Regiment was attacking northeast into the Banholz Woods, just north of Sens, Germany, located just in the Saar-Moselle Triangle. The woods were full of German defenses and experienced troops, including many hidden panzer tanks and seasoned panzer grenadiers. Through strong defenses and very powerful counterattacks by the Germans, the Americans became completely overwhelmed from multiple directions. After intense fighting, the 376th was forced to retreat, and the attack ultimately failed. Jack was severely wounded during the fight and was unable to be rescued. He was captured by the Germans and taken to a POW camp, where he developed severe infections and succumbed to his wounds 11 days later on February 21st, 1945. Tommy Nix. Tommy, a soldier in the 1st Infantry Division, took part in the initial D-Day landings in Normandy, France. His regiment landed in the Easy Red sector of Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. By June 8th, the regiment had fought 4 miles inland through the hedgerows of the French countryside to reach the hamlet of Mandeville, where they repulsed a heavy German counterattack in the middle of the night. On the morning of June 9th, Tommy's 3rd Battalion of the 18th Infantry Regiment kept pushing further in a collective effort to increase the Normandy beachhead. The regiment, moving south from the beach, encountered stiff German resistance in the dense interlocked hedgerows. Throughout the day, they maneuvered under constant enemy small arms fire, incoming artillery and mortars, and machine gun nests, well hidden in strategic locations. The fighting was severe and often within point-blank range. As Tommy's company was fighting in the vicinity of Gauville, he was severely wounded and taken off the line. Sadly, he later succumbed to his wounds the following day. His heroic actions during the course of the day, along with his complete disregard for his own safety and protecting the men in his company, earned him a Silver Star and a Purple Heart for his sacrifice. Jack Thomas. At 3:30 a.m. on March 16, 1945, located in northeastern France near the German border, Jack's Company A of the 15th Infantry Regiment was moving northeast on foot from the French village of Ormersviller. The German border lies just half a mile to the north. They were accompanied by armored support consisting of M4 Sherman tanks and tank destroyers. The Germans had mined the roads heavily, and progress was slow as engineers worked to clear them of the deadly obstacles. Additionally, the men were shelled by the enemy during the night as they advanced. Their objective was to capture an area around another small village called Louisville, which is located a short distance to the northeast. Beyond this town lay the German Siegfried Line, a formidable enemy defensive position rife with enemy infantry, hardened concrete bunkers, and machine gun pillboxes. At 12:45 p.m., Jack's company reached the western outskirts of Louisville, but the supporting armor was stopped just before the town at a large creek. The Germans had blown up the bridges during the night ahead of the advancing Americans. When they arrived, the small town was free of the enemy, but German troops could be seen moving in the distance, several hundred yards to the northeast. At precisely 1:02 p.m., fighter planes began diving over the town and strafing the American troops. The men dashed about while trying to take cover anywhere they could. Someone shouted out, "They're ours!" It was then realized that they were indeed American planes. The fighters had mistaken them for enemy troops. The men on the ground immediately began laying out red panels in the open and setting off yellow smoke grenades to signal that they were friendly. Still, the planes came back and strafed them again. They radioed division headquarters to halt the attack, but damage had already been done. Jack was one of the casualties. During the initial strafing, Jack sustained multiple wounds across his body, including his head, from a rocket fired by one of the American planes. He was killed instantly. Robbie Watts. Robbie was a tech sergeant, grade 5, in the U.S. Army's Persian Gulf Command. He was stationed in Iraq and Iran. His duties in the PGC involved overseeing the construction of vital railways, bridges, and train tunnels, so the U.S. military could provide aid to the Russian army for its parallel efforts in fighting the Germans. On January 10, 1944, Robbie's company was stationed in the mountains of Iran. They were grading the side of a mountain to clear a path for a railroad when a landslide began. Robbie quickly moved to the downhill side of the equipment to protect himself from the tumbling rocks and debris, but the equipment slipped under the pressure of the landslide and rolled over on top of him. Sadly, Robbie was pinned underneath and crushed to death. Robbie was buried in a temporary Allied war cemetery in the Golhak area of Tehran. He was later repatriated home and is now buried in Pine Log United Methodist Church Cemetery near Rydell, Georgia. Hicks. Extensive research has been conducted, but virtually no personal information has been found for Glenn Hicks from Gordon County, Georgia, and no military details have been uncovered under the same name. One possible explanation is that Glenn might be a nickname or even a middle name not listed on any official documents. Glenn Hicks, 16 years old, was recorded in the 1930 census, living in Sonoraville, Georgia, in the home of his paternal grandmother, Mrs. Liza Jane Hicks. However, no other information has been found. Nevertheless, He was a real person with a real life. He was remembered fondly by his fellow students, his friends, and his family.